On this edition of Read with Ronald, I read Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. First published in 1938, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca follows Mrs. De Winter as she struggles to be happy in her new marriage while contending with the looming shadow left behind at Manderley following the death of her husband's first wife, Rebecca. Rebecca was du Maurier's fifth novel, which she wrote in 4 months after years of writer's block. It was inspired by her own marriage, influenced by one of her favorite novels, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and sold 200,000 copies within the first 4 months of publication. Rebecca has been adapted several times for the stage and the screen. My history with this book starts in my childhood. Rebecca is one of my mom's favorite Hitchcock movies. She's a huge Hitchcock fan. That's why I wouldn't say know the story of Rebecca, but like I'm familiar with it. One day I was on YouTube and I saw this video talking about Rebecca the book and Rebecca the movie. You know, I watched that video, I enjoyed it, and then I went and I got the book because I wanted to watch the movie for myself. I've seen it as a child, but I didn't really remember much about it. I wanted to watch it when I was like older and see if I was enjoyed as I was older. So I bought the book first because I wanted to read the book first, took it on a cruise with me to read, and I did not get past the first chapter. Cut to this year, I see Rebecca on my bookshelf. I'm like, okay, let's try this again. I've tried to read it a few times, but each time I could not get past the first chapter. This time I was determined to read through this book because I really want to see the movies, and that's how I got Rebecca the book. Here is the spoiler-free version of the story. The story is about Mrs. De Winter. She has just married the wealthy Max De Winter. She is his second wife. Rebecca is his first wife. Mrs. De Winter, the second wife, she moves to his house, Manderley. She is struggling against contending with the memory of Rebecca at Manderley because the memory of her is very strong there. So from this point on, I will be talking fully about the plot and fully about what's going on. So if you don't want to be spoiled on the story, thank you for watching up to this point, but feel free to go ahead and turn off. And who knows, if you decide after you read the book and maybe watch the movies and you want to come back and see my thoughts on them, well then feel free. Today is February 6th. I've started reading Rebecca. Rebecca starts with the protagonist, who is unnamed as of right now. I don't know if she'll ever be named, but she's unnamed as of right now. We start off and she's having a dream of Manderley. Manderley is the place she used to live in England. She dreams of Manderley and she's dreaming of walking up the path towards the house. The path is overgrown with all types of plants and plant life. She gets up to the house, and the house, she says the house is untouched, but the garden is also overgrown with all types of different plants, all types of different flora. Basically, she dreams of Manderley. She basically talks about how they can never go back there again and that they don't like talking about Manderley. The day that she's referring to is her and Max De Winter, who is her husband, the protagonist. She's the second wife. She and Max have fled from Manderley for some unknown reason. They are now living in a small hotel. And they've fled Manderley, and they don't like to talk about Manderley. They don't like to think about Manderley because it makes them sad. They instead tend to distract themselves with other bits of English news. We kind of get like an inkling of what the issue is, at least with the second wife, is that a lot of people compared her to the first wife, who was Rebecca. Rebecca was Max's first wife. Everybody loved her, and she's dead. We find out that the second wife really she kind of felt scared living at Manderley. It kind of felt like Manderley was still kind of alive, like with Rebecca's spirit. Kind of like she was still there, as a shadow hanging over the house, especially because everybody was comparing the second wife to Rebecca, pointing out all the second wife's flaws in comparison to Rebecca. So we kind of get an inkling kind of what was wrong as far as concerning the second wife. So that's where I am so far. She first starts reflecting on how she first met Max, and they first met in Monte Carlo when she was a paid companion to an upper-class socialite called Mrs. Van Hopper. Today is February 13th. I am still reading Rebecca. We pick up with Mrs. Van Hopper and the protagonist, who is still unnamed. I think she might go unnamed for the whole book. And if she does, that's really going to speak to how overshadowed she feels by Rebecca, because she don't even give her own name in the book that she's narrating. She and Mrs. Van Hopper, they're sitting in dinner. Mrs. Van Hopper sends her to their hotel room to go get a letter because Mrs. Van Hopper is a snob and a social climber. And so she always wants to claim like social relevance to like the big people in society. When she sees Max de Winter, she sends the protagonist to go get this letter from her nephew to use as a form of introduction to Max de Winter. And so the protagonist goes up there. She's contemplating taking her time to give Max de Winter time to get away. But when she gets back down there, Mrs. Van Hopper has taken matters into her own hands, and she has basically risked a face-to-face introduction with no like leading in to the introduction. So Mrs. Van Hopper, the protagonist, and Max de Winter, they're all sitting, they're talking. Max, he's very charming, but he's also very annoyed with Mrs. Van Hopper because she keeps talking about Manderley. He's grieving the death of Rebecca, and Mrs. Van Hopper, for her to be such a snob and a social climber, she has no social cues. Because you would think you wouldn't talk about a person's home to somebody who just lost their wife, who was living in the home with their wife, but Mrs. Van Hopper has no social cues, and the protagonist, she's picking up on like all of the shade that Max is throwing at Mrs. Van Hopper, but Miss Van Hopper, she's not catching none of it. Max, he tries to talk to the protagonist, but Mrs. Van Hopper, she shuts it down because she's like, you know, she young and dumb, she don't have nothing to say, she can't even appreciate that she in Monte Carlo right now. And so basically Mrs. Van Hopper, she sees the protagonist as like less than her, kind of like lower class. And I'm like, she's a social climber, she's a snob, and she's classist. And so Mrs. Van Hopper, she basically dominates the conversation. Max is annoyed. The protagonist, she's embarrassed by Mrs. Van Hopper's actions. And then after the conversation, after Max and them part, and he throws like one final shade at Mrs. Van Hopper that she finally catches, they part, and Mrs. Van Hopper's like, oh, protagonist, you were too forward in the conversation and you embarrassed me. You need to try and have more social grace. And I'm like, how did she embarrass you? She said all of 3 words, and they were in response to a question that Max asked her. How is she being too forward? After they part ways, Mrs. Van Hopper and the protagonist, they return to their hotel suite so Mrs. Van Hopper can get fitted for a dress. And the protagonist, she goes, she sits down, she starts sketching Max, and like, this portrait is called Gentleman Unknown that she fell in love with. She feels like Max would look like the man in that portrait. So she starts sketching him, and then she receives a letter that basically apologizes to her for the rudeness that was in the conversation. She's not really sure who it's from, but it's implied that it's from Max because of all the shade he was throwing. And that's where I left off at. Today is March 22nd. I'm still reading Rebecca. The protagonist is not named, but I don't want to keep calling her protag and protagonist, so I'm just going to call her Lady. These first few chapters are Lady reflecting on when she was younger. She's telling it from the present day of what's taking place in the story, but she's reflecting on it from a present day stance. And we learned that she was 21 around this time. Mrs. Van Hopper has come down with the flu while they are out in Monte Carlo. Lady is not equipped to take care of her, so they have to get a nurse. So Lady, she has free time, so she goes down to the restaurant and she sees Max in there again. She's embarrassed about the way Mrs. Van Hopper behaved the day before, so she's too embarrassed to talk to him, so she's trying to avoid him. And in her attempt to avoid him, she accidentally knocks a vase over at the table she sits at. Water gets everywhere, and Max notices, and he comes over to help her get situated, and the waiter of course comes over to help get the situation situated because Max is over there. And so Lady, she's super embarrassed about the whole thing, but Max tells her it's nothing to worry about, and he invites her to come eat with him. Max reveals that he's the one who sent the note. He and Lady get to talking. Lady, of course, brings up Manderley, and Max is sensitive about Manderley, and so he doesn't really like to talk about it. Lady first heard of Manderley when she was younger because she was out shopping and she saw a postcard of it, and she bought a postcard and she asked the salesperson what place was on the postcard, and the person looked at her like she was crazy because she didn't know what Manderley was. And so Lady explains her relationship to Mrs. Van Hopper, and she tells Max that she is basically a hired companion for Mrs. Van Hopper, and her name is unusual. We don't get what her name actually is, but we do know that her name is unusual for a woman because she's named after her father. She and her father have the same name. And so she starts telling Max about her father and stuff like that, and her father is a sore subject for her, just like Manderley is a sore subject for Max. And she and Max have a good time at lunch. And so while they're at lunch, Max explains his side of the family. He has a grandmother and a sister that he rarely sees, so he feels very lonely. And so he asks her, what does she plan on doing that day? And Lady is like, oh, I just plan to do some sketching. Max offers to drive her around to the locations she wants to sketch, and Lady, of course, is embarrassed by this because she doesn't want to come across as begging him for a ride to places, because like I said earlier, Lady is of a lower class and Max is like of a higher class. So Lady is being very humble because she's of a lower class and she doesn't even really feel like she'll have the honor of speaking to Max because he's of a higher class. And so Max offers to take her around to the places she wants to sketch and he does so. Lady is very humble about the whole thing and she really dislikes being treated with importance because she's aware of her humble beginning. She doesn't like to be treated like she's somebody of importance because she feels like it's not her place to be treated that way because that's not how she was raised and that's not how she came up, because her father severely disliked people of the upper class because they always acted like they were better than people of lower class. And so she tells a story about how Mrs. Van Hopper's dressmaker came to the hotel with 3 dresses to give to Miss Van Hopper, and Lady, she pictured the dressmaker as being very poor and working very hard on these dresses. And so when she was escorting the dressmaker out of the hotel, the dressmaker tried to give her some money for basically bringing Mrs. Van Hopper to her business to try on her dresses. And Lady, she's very embarrassed about it. She doesn't want to take the money. And so the dressmaker is like, well, okay, whatever. You don't have to take the money, but let me do something for you. You know, let me give you a free dress instead. And Lady, she doesn't take up the offer because, like I said, she's very humble. And Max tells her that she is not cut out for her line of work because in her line of work, things like that is normal. And Lady, of course, doesn't like stuff like that. So Max tells her she's in the wrong line of work. And he says it as a joke. So Max and Lady, they spend the day together and Lady starts coming out of her shell with Max. And Max takes her to this cliff that looks over like all of Monte Carlo. Lady notices that Max is being kind of distant and weird. He's kind of staring off the cliff a little bit. And so Lady asks him, has he been there before? And Max, he doesn't really pay her no mind. So Lady begins to worry that she's prejudged Max and that he might have some type of mental difference. And so Lady says something else to Max, and Max finally notices that she's talking to him, and he gets very embarrassed and he apologizes for bringing her up there, and they drive back to the hotel. And on the way back to the hotel, Max talks about Manderley. He doesn't talk about what it's like there to live there, but he does talk about like what it looks like and how pretty it is. And so the two, they get back to the hotel, and Lady, she reaches inside Max's glove compartment to get her gloves. When she's getting her gloves, she brushes her hand against this book. And so she looks at the book, but she doesn't really touch it. And Max is like, oh, you can take it with you if you want. So she takes it with her and they part ways. She goes into the hotel, but she's not ready to go back to be with Miss Van Hopper yet because she's still feeling kind of like on cloud 9 from her trip with Max. So she goes sit in the hotel lounge instead and opens the book, and it's a poetry book. And inside the poetry book, there's a dedication to Max, and it's from Rebecca. And Rebecca is Max's first wife who died. And so she reads this dedication. She reads a poem that seems to be heavily looked at by Max because the page automatically opens to it. And so after she reads that poem and she realizes that it's a poetry book from Rebecca, she closes it and she sits it to the side and she starts to wonder about Max and why he's so mysterious. And she recalls Mrs. Van Hopper telling her Rebecca died by drowning in a bay outside of Manderley. Lady spends the next 2 weeks driving around Monte Carlo with Max, but she lies to Mrs. Van Hopper and tells Mrs. Van Hopper that she's playing tennis with a tennis professional who's giving her tennis lessons. And so Lady recalls how burdensome it was to fall in love with Max because it was just so new to her and it wasn't something that she was used to. And then on top of that, he had been previously married. She wants to cherish the moment because she feels like her life is going to go back to normal after Monte Carlo ends. So she wants to cherish the moment, and she tells Max she wants to cherish it. And she realizes how different she is from Max because she's younger and he's older. Max, of course, does not like to hear this from Lady because Max prefers to live in the now. He does not want to relive the past because he's still grieving the death of Rebecca. And Max tells Lady that he prefers to live in the now because Lady is different and because she's not like a refined lady, because Lady makes this comment about how she sometimes wishes she was a lady that was dressed up in black satin and had a string of pearls around her neck and how she feels so different from them. And Max tells her he prefers her like that. She's humble and she's different and she's young. And so Lady realizes she really knows nothing about Max. And so she tells Max that she feels like this and she ends up bringing up Rebecca, and Rebecca causes kind of like an awkward silence between the two, and then Max goes on this tangent. Lady realizes that she might lose Max as a friend because she's brought up Rebecca because she knows he doesn't like to talk about her or Manderley. And so Max goes on this tangent and he tells her that he prefers Lady's company because Lady is, of course, humble and young and different. She's not like Rebecca, and she actually erases Rebecca from his mind, and he prefers Lady because Lady grounds him in the now, and he can forget about Rebecca and doesn't have to think about her and doesn't have to think about Manderley. But he tells Lady that if she doesn't like this, then she can leave. And so Lady, she's taken aback by this. She's embarrassed that she brought up Rebecca, and so she starts crying, but she like cries silently, and she doesn't wipe away the tears because she doesn't want to cause any further like issues between them. She's dreading going back to Mrs. Van Hopper because she realizes that she's caused a rift between her and Max. And so now she knows that things are going to come to an end. So she's dreading going back to Mrs. Van Hopper. She's dreading going back to that life of being the shy, basically church mouse, because she doesn't want that for her life now that she's gotten a taste of what it's like to be out of her shell. And so Max gives her a handkerchief to wipe her face, and he hugs her close and holds her close and tells her that he wants her to forget everything he just said. He didn't mean to make her cry like that. And he cheers her up and he tells her to call him Maxim. So Mrs. Van Hopper, she seems to be recovering well from her flu. And so when Lady gets back to the hotel, Mrs. Van Hopper questions her on whether Max is still at the hotel. And Lady becomes worried because she feels like she's been discovered. She's like, oh my gosh, somebody's seen me out with him. And they told Mrs. Van Hopper, and now Mrs. Van Hopper's gonna go in on me. You know, basically what she said the first time about Lady, when they first talked to him about how she was taking too much of his attention and being too forward. She feels like Van Hopper's going to say that again, and so Lady is concerned that somebody has told Mrs. Van Hopper about her activities and that she's lied about where she's been. But Mrs. Van Hopper doesn't say anything about that, and instead starts talking more about Rebecca and starts talking about how Rebecca was such a nice lady and how she seemed very nice and how they had such grand parties at Manderley and how Rebecca just seemed like such a fine and refined lady. This is the point when Lady starts to feel kind of in Rebecca's shadow, which is honestly why I believe they don't say Lady's actual name in the book, to further emphasize that she is in Rebecca's shadow. She reflects on how Rebecca got to call Max Max, but Lady has to call him Maxim because Maxim is what everybody in his family calls him, whereas Max was just strictly for Rebecca, and so Lady starts to feel like she's in Rebecca's shadow. Today is April 9th. I'm still reading Rebecca. Lady and Max, they are on the move. And Lady, she's still reflecting on how she and Max got together, and she says that she knew that they were never returning to Monte Carlo. And so Mrs. Van Hopper, she gets a letter from her daughter that her granddaughter is sick, and so she wants to go to New York and she wants to take Lady with her, but Lady doesn't want to go because she's fallen in love with Max and she wants to stay with Max. And so because she's accepted the inevitable that she's leaving, she imagines how her and Max parting ways is going to go. Max is in Cannes and he's not expected to be back until midnight, and Lady is over Mrs. Van Hopper. The next day, Max is back from Cannes, and so Mrs. Van Hopper tells Lady to go downstairs and to go make the arrangements for them to leave on an earlier train, but Lady instead goes to see Max, and she tells Max that they are leaving, and so Max basically proposes marriage to her. And Lady thinks that he's just being kind, but Max is like, no, I really want to marry you because she's nothing like Rebecca, so he just wants to marry her. And he's like, I want to take you with me and we can get married in a courthouse. And so Lady, of course, is shocked by this, but she accepts, and she's imagining it going one way, but it ends up going another way. Max takes her to go back to Mrs. Van Hopper. And so while Max is talking to Mrs. Van Hopper, Lady is in the room, waiting on him to break the news to her, and she's looking at the poetry books that Max gave her again. She tears out the From Rebecca to Max page and she burns it because she's like, I'm the lady in his life now, Rebecca's the past. And she says, get thee behind me, Satan. And I'm like, you doing all this over Rebecca? Okay. And so after Max tells Mrs. Van Hopper and clears out, Mrs. Van Hopper confronts Lady, and she's being a busybody. Why didn't you tell me? I should have suspected that you were doing something besides tennis lessons. I'm not that slow, stuff like that. And she basically tells Lady, you don't seem like you're up to be mistress of Manderley. Rebecca was everything and you're nothing like her. And Max, he hasn't exactly told Lady that he loves her. He just proposed marriage to her, but he hasn't said once that he loves her. And so Mrs. Van Hopper, she rubs that in. And so then Max and Lady, they go to Manderley in May, and Lady is nervous about it. And so when they pull up, the staff is like in the parlor waiting on them, and Max is like, ugh, why are they all here? He suspects that the head of running the house, Mrs. Danvers, Danvers, has gathered everyone to welcome Max back. And so he and Lady, they go in the house, and Lady is creeped out by Mrs. Danvers because Mrs. Danvers seems to be smirking at her and like sizing her up, and determines that Lady is not up to Rebecca's level. And so Lady, she's slowly adjusting to being at Manderley, and Mrs. Danvers shows her to her room and lets Lady know that she will be assisting her until her own personal maid arrives. And Lady, of course, she's trying to be super humble and stuff like that. And Danvers is basically like looking at her crazy for being humble. And while they're talking, Danvers reveals that she came to Manderley when Rebecca came to Manderley, and she respected Rebecca as the lady of the house. Max and Lady, they will be staying in the east wing of the house because Max has had all of their stuff moved to the east wing. The east wing looks over the garden, and the west wing looks over the sea. And so Rebecca and Max, they used to stay in the west wing. After her death, he's had all their stuff moved to the east wing. And so after Lady and Mrs. Danvers talk, Max comes in and he shows Lady around Manderley, and she's happy because things are seeming to go back to normal. And she's starting to grow comfortable, but she gets constant reminders that Rebecca was there before her. And so she feels kind of inferior to Rebecca. And so as she's settling into Manderley, Lady realizes that she was not prepared for how efficiently run Manderley is. It's like everything runs on a schedule, and Lady is still adjusting to that schedule. It's like she seems out of place because she wants to do her own thing, but the house is still running on the schedule of how things went when Rebecca was there. So everybody's kind of just shocked that Lady hasn't fallen in line with Rebecca's schedule. And so Max's sister Beatrice is coming for a visit. And so Lady, of course, has to get prepared for that, but she's scared and nervous over it. And so she doesn't know the routine of the house. And so one of the servants, Frith, points her in the right direction, which is to the morning room. And in the morning room are like Max's two dogs. One is a female dog that doesn't seem to like Lady all that much, and the other is Jasper, who is very friendly. And so Lady goes into this room and she realizes that the room is like covered in the memory of Rebecca. Like her favorite flowers are in there. Rebecca's writing is all over the place. Everything is organized how Rebecca wanted it, and Lady realizes that she really is not up to Rebecca's level. And so while she's in there, she gets a telephone call from Mrs. Danvers, and Lady, of course, tells Mrs. Danvers that, oh, Mrs. De Winter is not here. And so Mrs. Danvers is like, Lady, I'm calling you from the house phone just to let you know like what's going on. I need you to approve the menu for dinner. Let me know if you want anything changed, because Rebecca was very particular about how she wanted her meals done. And Lady's like, oh, well, Mrs. Danvers, just do it how you see fit. I'm not really all that picky. Lady still feels like Mrs. Danvers sees her as inferior to Rebecca because Rebecca is just like, she wanted things this way. She was like this, she was like that. And Lady's just like, I'm just here. Don't change nothing on account of me. Leave everything the way it is. I'll adapt. And so Lady, she starts writing a letter to Mrs. Van Hopper because Rebecca was apparently, during that time, that's when she would write her letters and stuff like that. So Lady starts writing a letter of her own. She's writing to Mrs. Van Hopper, and as she's writing, she realizes really just how second rate she is to Rebecca. And so Beatrice and her husband Giles arrive, and then Max's agent Crawley also arrives, but Lady is nervous about receiving them all, so she runs off out of the morning room, and she like ducks into the first door she comes to, and it goes into this long stone passageway, and she's running up the passageway. She comes across one of the maids who was surprised to see her there, and she's running and she's running, and she comes to like this dark part of the house that she's never seen before. And so she pushes open one of the doors, and she sees that the room is like covered in like furniture with plastic all over the place, and Lady doesn't want to disturb anything. And so she like walks down the hall, and she goes to look out the window, and she sees the sea, and she realizes that she's in the west wing of the house. And Lady prefers the east wing of the house because it overlooks the rose garden, and she's not really a fan of the sea like that. And so as she's on her way to leave the west wing, she's caught by Mrs. Danvers, and she apologizes for being in the west wing, and Mrs. Danvers is like, there's no need to apologize. If you wanted to see the west wing, I can have it arranged for you to look at. And Lady's like, oh no, that's not necessary. And so Mrs. Danvers, of course, is insisting that she show her the west wing, and Lady is kind of like creeped out about that. And so Mrs. Danvers escorts her back to the main part of the house and lets her know, oh hey, the guests are here, you might want to go, greet them and stuff like that. And so Lady agrees, and she feels like Mrs. Danvers is kind of like watching her and keeping her in check, and she's kind of nervous about that. And so Lady goes in there to meet all the guests, and they all comment on how she's not really what they expected. Max's sister Beatrice, he and her, they keep getting into it over like small stuff like his health and the house and stuff like that. They keep getting into it. And so Lady, she keeps redirecting the conversation to make Max comfortable. And so one time she takes control of the conversation and she accidentally brings up the bay because that's where Rebecca died. And so everything gets all awkward. And so they go out to eat lunch. And so they're eating lunch and everything is going well until it's time for lunch to end. And Max, he starts getting restless and Lady doesn't know what to do because she's still not familiar with the schedule of the house. And so Max, he gets irritated and he's like, well, let's just go for a walk in the garden. And so they all go out to the garden to go walking. And while they're out there walking, Lady talks to Beatrice, and Beatrice expresses that she hopes that Lady will be happy with Max. She was surprised at how young she was, and she just wasn't what she expected Lady to be like because Lady is nothing like Rebecca. And she also says that Mrs. Danvers was very fond of Rebecca, and she doesn't expect Mrs. Danvers to mind if Lady starts taking command of the house. But Lady says, of course, that she's not there to take command of the house. She's there because she loves Max. And she doesn't want to interfere with how Mrs. Danvers is running things because she thinks Mrs. Danvers is doing a good job. And so while they're out there walking, the men come back and they all sit around and they talk. And Lady realizes that Max kind of treats her the same way that he treats Jasper, kind of like a dog. She's like, oh, he's affectionate towards me like he is towards a dog. Like he pats me on the head and, he says nice things to me. But it's not really like the kind of romantic love that she wants. And so Beatrice and Giles, on their way out the door, Lady insists that they show the East Wing because it's been remodeled. And of course, Beatrice and Lady talk some more. And Beatrice is insistent that she get them a wedding gift since she wasn't invited to the courthouse wedding that Max wanted in a hurry. And so Beatrice, her last comment is basically telling Lady, oh, you're nothing like I expected because you're nothing like Rebecca. And so after everybody leaves, Max decides that he wants to go for a walk in the rain. Forces one of the servants to get Lady a raincoat from nowhere. And the raincoat, it doesn't fit her, but Max doesn't care because he's irritable and he wants to go for this walk. So he, Lady, and Jasper go on the walk. And so while they're out on the walk, Jasper wants to go like down one path, but Max is like, no, Jasper, we're going this way. So they go that way. They go down to the beach and they have them a good time. They play on the beach and stuff like that. And so as it's time to go, Lady realizes that Jasper is missing. So she goes in search of Jasper and Max is like, oh, don't worry about the dog. Come on. He knows his way back to the house. But Lady insists that she finds Jasper because she doesn't want him out there all alone. She's scared something might have happened to him. So she goes climbing over these rocks and she comes to another part of the beach. And there's this man there digging in the beach for shells and Jasper is there barking at him. And so Lady, she's trying to get Jasper to come on, but Jasper won't come on. She talks to the man a little bit, but the man seems to not really be comprehending what the conversation is about. So Lady goes into this nearby beach house. And when she goes into the nearby beach house, she notices how organized everything is. It looks very well put together, but it looks like it hasn't been lived in because there's a lot of water damage in there. And so she goes in there, she gets a piece of rope and she ties it around Jasper's neck. And as she's walking Jasper's back, Max is waiting on them. Max is irritated with her because she went to go get Jasper instead of doing what he said to do. And he and Lady, they get in an argument. And Lady, she tries to drop the argument, but Max is like, no, women always do this. Y'all always want to drop an argument when y'all know y'all are wrong. Lady apologizes for not doing what Max wanted. And Max reveals that the man down there is one of the sons of the keepers of the ground. And his name is Ben. And that the cottage was supposed to be locked, but it wasn't locked when Lady went in there. And so Max is irritated about that. And so they get back to the house and Max goes into the library and orders tea. And Lady, she's unsure where to go to first, so she eventually goes to Max. And she apologizes to Max for making him angry. And Max is like, I'm not angry, I'm just irritated by today for some reason. It's not you, it's me. And so they sit and they have tea. And when the tea comes in, Lady realizes that everything is back to normal, treating her like he treats Jasper. When she takes the raincoat off, Frith has handed her the handkerchief that fell out the pocket, and that was in the hallway. So then while she's in there, she pulls the handkerchief out and she realizes it's not hers. It's Rebecca's. And so she realizes that the coat that she had on was Rebecca's.
I didn't know ratchet was a language. This is in ratchet.
Every chapter of this book just seems like, oh, here's this thing for Lady. Oh, Lady's not like Rebecca. Oh, Rebecca's better than Lady. I'm like, if y'all say Rebecca darn name one more time, I'm getting irritated. Because it's like they keep bringing up how Lady not like Rebecca. I'm like, I get it. This lady not like Rebecca. Rebecca gone. She dead. This new lady here. That's all y'all talk about is Rebecca, Rebecca, Rebecca. Y'all got that lady in y'all mouth so much. I'm sick of hearing about Rebecca. I want to hear about Lady. I want to know what Lady name is. Today is April 19th. I'm still reading Rebecca. I decided to take this moment to express my thoughts on what's going on in the plot so far. I have a few theories. My first theory is that Mrs. Danvers is Rebecca's mother. And the reason I have this theory is because she came to Manderley the same time Rebecca came. And we just got the description of what Rebecca looked like. She was very pale. She had long, dark hair. Mrs. Danvers is described as being she kind of looked like a skeleton. You know, she just got a dark aura around her. So I'm like, I feel like she might have been her mother. Because it's like she came to Manderley around the same time that Rebecca came, and she's very fond of Rebecca. You know, she gets super upset about the china cup being broken. I feel like she's her mother because there's no other reason for Mrs. Danvers to be so fond of Rebecca and to be wanting to preserve her memory as much as possible to the point that she disliked Lady for basically being the new wife and the new mistress of the house, unless she was Rebecca's mother. But I feel like even if she was Rebecca's mother, it would have been said by now if it was known. So it's possible she might have been Rebecca's mother and they just didn't make it known. My second theory concerns how Rebecca died. So we find out in, I want to say chapter 12, that Rebecca died in a boating accident. She was out on the bay at night in the boat and the boat capsized and she drowned and she was found like 2 hours away. So that's what we learned about her death. I get the vibes from this book that Rebecca did not like being the mistress of Manderley, for like kind of the same reason that Lady is kind of like not liking, because Lady feels out of place because everybody's like, oh, you're not like Rebecca, oh, you're so different from Rebecca. And of course Lady is like, she takes it as a negative, but everybody's like, oh no, it's a positive. You're nothing like her. You just bring something different whenever she actually speaks up and addresses it. But I'm thinking Rebecca might not have liked being the mistress of Manderley for the same exact reason, because everybody looked up to her so much and put her on a pedestal so much that she just got sick of it and annoyed with it. And it's just like, it was a lot of pressure on her. I feel like she might have purposely capsized that boat, purposely drowned herself. Those are my theories on who Mrs. Danvers is in relation to Rebecca and what happened with Rebecca, but we'll see if I'm right. My other thing is these people, they got Rebecca name in their mouth entirely too much. I'm sick of hearing about how wonderful, how amazing this lady was and how Lady is nothing like her. It's like, that's all y'all talk about. Say something different. Say something different! I don't know what my rating on this book is so far. I don't know my enjoyment level, because that's the other thing. I feel like I'm waiting on this plot to pick up. I'm about halfway through the book and it still feels like I'm waiting on the book to pick up, and I'm waiting on the plot to pick up and actually start. That's what this book feels like. If this is like a slow burn type of story, then that's okay, but the ending better be phenomenal. I can't even really tell you if I'm enjoying it or not because I feel like I'm still waiting on the plot to start. So today's April 22nd. I'm still reading Rebecca. I am up to chapter 18. So Lady, she tries to forget what happened at the cottage, but she can't. She can't forget it because she's curious. And it's like, it's put up this wall between her and Max because Lady is trying to avoid upsetting Max again because she wants Max to be pleased with her. She doesn't want him being upset with her. But because she's curious about the cottage and because she doesn't want Max being upset again, it creates this anxiety in her. She's anxious that people are going to bring up the sea to Max and bring up Rebecca and all this other type of stuff. She doesn't want that to happen because she doesn't want Max getting upset. And so she's having this anxiety and she's already feeling out of place because everybody's like, oh, you're nothing like Rebecca. And this anxiety is making that worse. And so she takes on the role of being the mistress of the house a little bit. And she starts paying visiting calls to the people around town. And so one of the people she visits is the bishop's wife. And the bishop's wife, of course, is remarking on how unlike Rebecca Lady is. And she asks if they're going to start doing the fancy dress balls again. And Lady's like, what's that? And the bishop's wife is basically like, oh, it's this ball where we get dressed up in costumes. And I remember the one I went to last time. It was so wonderful. Rebecca did such a wonderful job with it. It was so amazing. I hope we do that again. And of course, the wife, she keeps bringing up Rebecca. It's kind of like an elephant in the room, but she don't want to address it, but she keep alluding to it. And so Lady finally says Rebecca's name. She's like, oh yeah, we haven't really considered it since Rebecca died. They get to talk about Rebecca and Lady's she's shocked with herself for finally speaking Rebecca's name. And she kind of feels a little bit of freedom for finally addressing the elephant in the room. And so Lady and the wife, they get done having their conversation. And the wife is like, oh, be sure to tell Mr. De Winter about the fancy dress ball. And Lady's like, yeah, okay. So she leaves. And Lady doesn't like the neighbors because she's like, they're nosy. They're always comparing her to Rebecca and criticizing her. She just knows that they're doing this behind her back. So she doesn't like the neighbors. She gets back to Manderley and she comes across Frank, who is walking up to Manderley. So she gets out the car and she starts walking with him. And so Lady, she's questioning him on the ball and she's questioning him on the cottage. cottage, and he's telling her like all of this stuff. And while she's questioning him, we find out that Rebecca died in a boating accident. She was out there at night and her boat capsized and she washed up 40 miles away 2 months later, and Max had to go identify her. And so the questions caused some awkwardness between Frank and Lady, and she starts unloading on him like all of her feelings and all her anxieties, and Frank reassures her. He's like, oh, nobody's looking at you like that. We're all very glad that you're not like Rebecca. And we are very happy that you've come into Max's life because you seem like a positive influence on him. And we hope that you'll continue to be a positive influence on him and continue making him happy and lead us into a new age of happiness. And he tells her not to tell Max her worries because it'll distress him and they don't want that. And so Lady ends the conversation by asking if Rebecca was beautiful, and Frank says yes, she was. So then the next chapter, Lady has not seen much of Mrs. Danvers, and she only talks to Mrs. Danvers over the phone. And Lady also has her new maid, Clarice. She's the daughter of someone who works at Manderley, and like she's very poor, but she's new to Manderley. She wasn't there when Rebecca was there, so Lady really likes Clarice because she and Clarice can like bond over the fact that they're both practically new to Manderley. And Lady actually relates more to Clarice and relates more to the servants of the house than she does to Max and the upper class people of the town. And so Lady, of course, because she relates to the servants and them more than she does the upper class people, she feels like the servants kind of look down on her for that because she's more humble and more plain. And Lady starts feeling sorry for Mrs. Danvers because she realizes that Mrs. Danvers was going to dislike anybody who took Rebecca's place, and she feels sorry for Mrs. Danvers because Mrs. Danvers obviously very clearly misses Rebecca. And so Lady, of course, Frank has encouraged her to like, forget the past, and Max has also encouraged her to forget the past and to try and live in the present. She can't focus on living in the present because the past is still in the present. Like everywhere she looks is like reminders of Rebecca. Beatrice sends Lady some books on painting as her wedding gift, and Lady loves them. She like shows them to Max, but Max is not really impressed with them, and she hasn't heard anything about Beatrice expressing her opinion on her to Max, so Lady doesn't know whether Beatrice likes her or not. And so of course when Lady gets these books, she's trying to like make herself at home in the morning room, and she accidentally breaks a china cup. And so she like sweeps up the pieces and she hides them in the drawer. And so because she does this and she doesn't tell anybody that she broke a china cup, Mrs. Danvers and Robert, who is one of the butlers, they get into it because Mrs. Danvers accuses him of stealing the china cup. And so they get into it and they present the issue to Max. Max sends Mrs. Danvers out to go get Robert. While they're out, Lady confesses to Max that she broke it and she hid it, and Max is like, why didn't you say something while they were in here? And Lady, I don't know, I guess I was just too nervous to say anything. So Max is like, you need to speak up and admit that you did this. And Lady begs him not to make her say anything, but Max is like, no, you need to speak up and say something. Danvers and Robert comes back in, and Max, of course, knowing Lady is shy and that she's not gonna do it, he takes the lead and he's like, oh, Mrs. Danvers, Lady is the one who broke the china cup, and she, was too nervous to tell you. And Mrs. Danvers is like, oh, that's all right, but I would prefer that Madam would tell me herself that she broke something. And so Lady admits to what she did. She tells them that it's in the drawer, and they basically agree to have it sent off to London to see if it can be fixed. And if it can't be fixed, then it is what it is. And so Max gets on Lady for not admitting to it when it first happened, and how she's acting like a servant and not like the lady of the house. And Lady's like, well, I relate more to the servants than I do the upper class people because I come from a similar background as the servants. And Max is like, no, you need to be acting like the lady of the house, and that she needs to try harder to fit in, and that she needs to like start acting more like the lady of the house. She accuses him of marrying her because she was not knowledgeable of what it takes to be a lady of the house. And so Max gets very upset about this, and he's like, what are you talking about? Lady do what she do. She talk out the side of her neck, and then when Max gets upset, she's like, oh, I didn't mean it. Oh, I didn't mean it. Please don't be upset with me, Max. I'm like, Lady, grow a spine. Grow a spine. Stand on what you said. Because you're feeling this way, and you won't tell Max about what you're feeling, and every time he gets upset, you want to, oh, I didn't mean it like that. No, stand on what you say so y'all can get this sorted out. You sitting there walking uncomfortable around your own house. And so, of course, Max gets upset, and Lady, she gets scared that Max is upset because she's never seen him be so upset before. And Max starts questioning whether he made the right decision in marrying Lady. And Lady, she's like, oh, yes, you made the right decision in marrying me. Oh, let's not be upset, darling. Stuff like that. And he's questioning whether he made a good decision marrying Lady because they have such a big age difference. Because remember, he's close to his 40s and Lady is 21. at the time. Lady's like, oh, our age has nothing to do with it. I love you for you. And so Lady asks him, are they happy? And Max is like, if you say we're happy, then we're happy. But Lady's not satisfied with that answer. And so she questions him on the morning room and like its significance and the significance of everything in there. And he reveals that the morning room was basically arranged when Rebecca first got there, and all that china that was in there, that was her china. And so then in the next chapter, Max goes away to a dinner in London, leaving Lady all alone at the house. She like feels this sense of anxiety that she's never going to see him again, but he calls and basically leaves a message saying he got there safely, but he doesn't speak to Lady directly. He just tells Frith, you know, Lady, she's glad that he got there safely. And so she feels like this newfound sense of freedom because she has, you know, free roam of the house. And so because she was so anxious, she skipped lunch. And so when she finally finds out that Max made it there safely, she's hungry. She takes some biscuits and an apple out of the kitchen and she goes off into the woods to eat them in secret. And so she has some free time to herself. And so she takes Jasper and goes down to the cove. And so she goes down there, she like lays in the grass for a little bit, pondering what she should do with her day. And she goes down to the Happy Valley beach, but of course Jasper, he climbs over the rocks again and goes to the Rebecca beach. So Lady follows him to the Rebecca beach. And so she starts noticing stuff, like she notices like one of the buoys. She's noticing like the ladder to get down to where like the dinghy would have been to get to the boat. She's noticing stuff about the bay she didn't notice the first time. And so then she goes over to the cottage. And when she gets over to the cottage, Jasper starts acting a straight up fool. He's barking. He's going off about stuff. Lady's like, Jasper, come here, but he's not listening. So she goes into the cottage and she spots Ben. Ben is hiding in the cottage and he was in there getting some fishing line. And Lady's like, oh, Ben, you know, you're not supposed to be in here. And Ben, of course, he is a little mentally behind. You know, he's basically saying he's sorry for being in there. Lady's like, it's okay. You can take the fishing line if you want, but don't come in here no more because Mr. De Winter doesn't like people being in here. And so Ben, of course, he tells Lady that she's nothing like Rebecca, but Lady doesn't understand. He keeps asking, oh, are you going to have me committed to an asylum? Are you going to have me committed to an asylum? And Lady's like, no, why would I do that? And so, of course, that makes Ben happy. And he's like, oh, you're nothing like her. And Lady's like, her who? And he's like, the other lady with the dark hair. She caught me in here one time and she told me if she ever caught me in here again, she would have me committed to an asylum. And Lady, of course, she don't understand who he's talking about, but it's very clearly Rebecca, because who else would it be, Lady? Come on now. She not understanding what he's trying to say. She think he out of his mind, so she snatch up Jasper. She take off running back to Manderley. She's creeped out. And so when she gets there, she notices this car hidden behind the rhododendrons. She looks up, she sees this man standing in the window. And like the man, he steps back and then she sees another hand close the window. She like, that hand belonged to Miss Danvers, so what they up there doing? Of course, she like, oh, Miss Danvers just got a friend over or something. She try to stay out the way. When she goes in the house, she's trying to stay out the way, but she hears Mrs. Danvers trying to sneak the man out, talking about some, oh, she got back earlier than expected. And Lady's like, well, what is going on? But she's still trying to stay out the way. But Jasper, of course, is nosy and basically gives her away. And so Jasper attracts the attention of the man. And so the man comes to the morning room. He meets Lady. He's very loud, very boisterous, very obnoxious. Lady does not like him. And so Mrs. Danvers also comes in, and basically his name is Jack Favell, and he came to see Mrs. Danvers. They talk for a little bit, and he basically invites Lady to come see his car, and Lady reluctantly goes, but she don't like this man. So she goes look at the car, and he, you know, strikes up a little bit of conversation, you know, makes some jokes here and there, and then he leaves. And before he leaves, he asks Lady not to mention that he was there to Max. She finds it very suspicious that he came when Max was out, when Robert was out, when Frith was out, and when she was supposed to be down at the beach and not back anytime soon. So she gets suspicious, and she's like, what's going on here? Why is this man in my man's house? She get a little suspicious, and so she decides to go investigate the West Wing, because that's where they were. And at this point, I'm like, okay, finally, Lady taking a stand. She gonna actually do something for once, right? So in the next chapter, she go up there, and the first room she goes to is the one that Mrs. Danvers came out of the last time she was in the West Wing. She goes in there, and she notices how well put together the room is. It looks like it's being kept very well, and it looks like it's being lived in. And she like starts looking around the room. She starts looking at all the stuff, and she realizes it's Rebecca's room. And she suspects it's been left exactly how it was the day Rebecca died. And so she feels very out of place in the room. She feels like she doesn't belong there. And she, you know, starts admiring stuff, starts touching stuff. Danvers comes in and catches her in the room. And she's like, oh, if you wanted to see everything, you could have told me. I've been waiting on you to come up here so we can look around. And so Danvers starts telling her all about the stuff in the room. She's like, oh, This is how the dress, this is how I had it laid out the night that she died. These are the shoes she used to wear to bed. She used to tell me, oh, throw me my shoes, Danny. These are her dresses. Aren't they lovely? Oh, you should have seen her. It was so magnificent. You know, just gushing about Rebecca, and Lady is uncomfortable the whole time. And Danvers explains how Rebecca personally chose her as her maid. Rebecca said that nobody else suited her as a maid aside from Danvers, and so Danvers was very honored to be chosen as Rebecca's maid. She makes a note to mention how Rebecca cut her hair later into the marriage, and how everybody hated it, but Rebecca loved it, and how Max used to come in and like comb her hair and brush her hair, and he seemed so much happier with Rebecca than he does now. And when she was discovered with no clothes on, her arms had been broken off, and her face was like very battered. Mrs. Danvers blames herself for Rebecca's death because she wasn't home when Rebecca died. She had gone to another town for the day, and Rebecca was out in London. And so when she came home, Rebecca had come home earlier than expected and had gone down to the cottage. It was storming badly that day. Mrs. Danvers, of course, she expressed her concerns to Max, and Max was like, oh, don't worry about it. Rebecca is probably not going to come home in this weather, and it's not unusual for her to be down at the cottage. So Mrs. Danvers, of course, she went back to her room to go to sleep, but she couldn't sleep. And so when it got morning, she went down there, and that's when she came across the accident. And she realized that Rebecca had died, and so she blames herself for it. And so like pieces of the boat would turn up over time until eventually Rebecca's body turned up. And so Danvers is the only one who handles the West Wing and like the maintenance of it. She doesn't let any of the other staff handle it. And so she tells Lady, if you ever want to come up here and look again, just let me know. I'll have everything arranged for you to look. And she tells Lady she can feel like Rebecca in every room, and she feels her essence all over the house. And asks Lady if Lady can feel it too. And Lady, of course, is like being Lady. And so she goes off to her room and she lies down. Max is slated to come home that day around 7 o'clock. Lady, she's had a restless night waiting on him, so she couldn't sleep, and she had nightmares that they were not on the same page. And so she wakes up and she feels very unattractive, and Max is supposed to come home at 7 that evening, and so she doesn't know what to do with herself for the day, and she doesn't feel the same sense of freedom she felt the day before. So Beatrice calls and invites her to go visit the grandmother. And so Lady's like, yeah, okay. So while she's waiting on Beatrice to come pick her up, she goes and waits in the garden. And while she's waiting in the garden, she feels uneasy because she feels like Mrs. Danvers is probably sneaking around looking at her. And so Beatrice finally comes and picks Lady up. And while they're driving there, Beatrice cannot drive. She's a terrible driver. And she's questioning Lady on like how she's feeling about being at Manderley and all other types of stuff. And she keeps questioning if Lady is pregnant because Lady does not look well. And so Lady asks Beatrice who Jack is. And Beatrice is like, oh, Jack, yeah, I met him one time. I didn't really like him all that much. I think he's like Rebecca's cousin or something. And so Lady is shocked because she's like, Rebecca's cousin? And she doesn't have time to like really like inquire more because they get to Grandma's house. When they get there, Beatrice introduces Lady to Gran. She don't really like remember too much, and it's like she's the only one living there. And so Beatrice talks to Grandma while Lady talks to the grandma's nurse. And Lady constantly wonders what the grandma was like when she was younger and still like had full control of her mind, and how she feels now being older. And then they have tea, and so while they're having tea, you know, Beatrice is talking about Max and Lady and them being at Manderley and talking about the wedding and stuff. And of course Lady, she's chiming in every now and then. And the grandma, she looks at Lady and she's like, who are you? And Beatrice is like, that's Max's wife. Remember I told you about her? And the grandma's like, no, Max's wife is Rebecca. Where's Rebecca? Why is Rebecca not here? And so she starts throwing a fit because she wants Rebecca. And so Lady and Beatrice, they leave. Beatrice is highly embarrassed because she's like, I didn't expect her to act like that. I should have considered something like this happening because she's very attached to Rebecca. I'm sorry for bringing you through this. And Lady's like, oh, no, it's okay. It's nothing to worry about. And so they leave, and Beatrice drops Lady off at like the gate because she has to hurry home. And Lady, she walks up the drive, and as she's walking up the drive, she spots Max's car. And so she rushes inside to like greet Max because she's super excited about him being home. And when she gets inside, she hears him going off. He's going off on Mrs. Danvers because somebody has told him that Jack was at the house. And he tells Mrs. Danvers, oh, if you want to see him outside the house, that's fine, but he's not welcome in this house anymore. And if he comes up in here anymore, we gonna have an issue. And so Lady like ducks out the way as Miss Danvers comes out the room, and Miss Danvers doesn't see her. And so Lady, she goes in to see Max, and Max is, you know, being very distant. He doesn't want to talk about what just transpired. And so then one Sunday, Manderley is flooded with visitors from all around the town. It was supposed to be just a normal little day for Max, Lady, and Frank to like sit down and talk and just have a normal Sunday afternoon. But then everybody in the town for some reason want to come visit them. So they have to entertain everybody. And Lady and Max are highly annoyed with it, because Lady, of course, is shy and Max does not like entertaining people. And so while they're there, one of the people, Lady Crowan, she brings up the fancy dress ball to Max. And she's like, oh, we're going to have another fancy dress ball. And Max basically leaves it up to Frank and Lady if they want to have another fancy dress ball, because it'll be Frank who's doing most of the like organizing. And Lady is the mistress of the house and the people want to have it in Lady's honor, because she is a bride and she didn't have a wedding. And so the both of them reluctantly agree to have this ball. And so after the guests leave, Lady and Frank, they joke about the ball. Max is annoyed with it. They agree that Frank and Mrs. Danvers are going to handle everything so Lady doesn't have to worry about anything. And Lady is kind of annoyed with this because she feels like Max treats her like a child and she wants to be treated like she's grown. And so everybody is excited about the ball. Lady has been staying out of Mrs. Danvers' way. The only thing she has to worry about is what she's going to wear. This is a costume ball. Max jokingly suggests that she dress up as Alice in Wonderland, and it's an allusion to something earlier he said in the book about her being like Alice in Wonderland, like wandering all over Manderley, like she's just in wonder of everything. And so he calls her jokingly Alice in Wonderland because she's like a child in Wonderland. And he treats her like a child. And Lady, of course, she doesn't like that Max treats her like a child. She wants to be treated like a grown woman. So she basically tells Max, oh, you're not going to know what I'm going to be dressed like at the ball. You're going to be so surprised and so shocked. And Max is like, okay, yeah, we'll see. She goes through like the art books that Beatrice gave her and starts sketching some of the dresses in them, but she doesn't like none of the sketches, so she throws them away. Here comes Mrs. Danvers with her sketches. Oh, the trash is always brought to me at the end of the day to like make sure nothing accidentally gets thrown out. I saw you threw these sketches away. Did you want to throw these away? And Lady's like, yes, I wanted to throw them away. And Mrs. Danvers, she being all nice. Have you figured out what you're going to wear to the ball yet? And Lady's like, no, I haven't figured it out. Mrs. Danvers is like, oh, well, if you need some inspiration, you should go look at like the dresses in the gallery. Specifically this one dress, the one white dress. And so Lady's like, you know what, you're right. Why didn't I think of that sooner? Lady takes a suggestion. She goes to tea with Max. And while she's there, she's thinking about Jack and Rebecca. Jack does not fit into her image of who Rebecca is. She's like, Rebecca's this very refined lady, so how could she have a cousin like Jack? And so she suspects that Rebecca was like taking pity on Jack, and it would cause issues between her and Max. And so while she's thinking about this, Max is like, what are you thinking about? And Lady's like, oh, nothing. And he's like, no, you thinking about something because it's written all over your face, and I don't like that look on your face. And Lady's like, what look? And he's like, you look like you like have some knowledge that I don't want you to have. Like, I like you with this more childlike expression. That's why I married you. You was looking more grown and more womanly. And so Lady's like, well, Max, I don't like that you treat me like a child. And Max, of course, he's not taking her seriously. He's like, I like you because you're youthful, and I want you to remain youthful-minded. And Lady, of course, does not like that because she wants Max to treat her like a wife, like an equal, like a companion, not like a child. And Max like, oh, you're just like Alice in Wonderland. Have you got your Alice in Wonderland costume yet? Just teasing her. And so Lady's like, you're not gonna know me at this ball. So she goes to the gallery after tea and she looks at this painting. It's a painting of Carolyn de Winter, who is one of Max's ancestors. She loves it. She takes inspiration from it and she sends it off to a dress shop in London to have it made. And so Manderley is getting ready for the ball. Everybody's excited. Beatrice and Giles come over to stay the night. Everybody's talking about what they're gonna dress up as, and Lady, she's being hush-hush about what she's gonna dress up as. And the ball is in her honor. So the night of the ball comes. Everybody's excited. Lady, she's getting herself ready. Beatrice tries to come and get a peek. And Lady's like, no, go away, go away. Her and Clarice, they're super excited. Lady, she go out there to the ball. Everybody waiting below. She tells the band director, oh, play the drum and introduce me as Miss Carolyn de Winter. She goes out there. Everybody looking at her. Their jaws are dropped looking at her. And so it's not the reaction she expected, so she starts being nervous. She expected everybody to laugh and like clap because, oh, she's dressed up like the lady in the picture. But no, everybody's jaws are dropped and they're staring at her like, oh my gosh. Max comes rushing up to her. He's like, what in the world are you doing? And she's like, what? I'm dressed up like Carolyn de Winter. Max is like, take that mess off. Take it off. Go put something else on. I don't care what you put on. Just go put something else on. And Lady's like, what is it? What did I do wrong? Max is like, go change now. She runs off. She like, don't know what to do. Don't know where to turn. She catches Miss Danvers standing in the back, skinning and grinning like, hee hee ha ha. And so she suspects that Miss Danvers set her up. And so she runs off crying back to her room to change. And that is where I left off. You cannot convince me that Mrs. Danvers is not Rebecca's mother. She is either Rebecca's mother or she is somebody who was very close to that family, like an auntie or something. If she was just a regular maid, she have no reason to be doing all this towards Lady if she was just a maid. I'm just gonna be serious. You cannot convince me because Mrs. Danvers is doing too much. She's doing too much. I was trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Oh, she's still grieving Rebecca. Oh, she, miss Rebecca. But no, what she did was uncalled for. What she did was uncalled for. It's uncalled for. You're doing too much, Mrs. Danvers. You're doing too much. My theory is she's the mother, but nobody knows that she's Rebecca's mother. But the only reason I think that might not be possible is because Mrs. Danvers herself says Rebecca referred to her as Danny. Rebecca wouldn't be calling her mother Danny. Rebecca would be calling her mother. But obviously she was in some way, shape, or form close to this family that Rebecca came from because she came to Manderley at the same time Rebecca came. She and Rebecca are very close, and she be sneaking Rebecca's cousin into the house to obviously reminisce on Rebecca. And she's obviously still missing Rebecca, still grieving her to the point that she's sitting up here making Lady look like a fool. And if Lady do not grow a darn spine. We are on chapter 18 of 27. This is Lady reminiscing on her younger years when she was 21. So I get it. She's probably grown since then, and she's looking back and thinking on how foolish she was at 21. But if this girl do not grow a darn spine, I get you not wanting to be in the way, I get you not wanting to really come in and change stuff, but it's at some point you need to take charge of the situation, because now Mrs. Danvers is straight up embarrassing you. She's straight up embarrassing you, straight up clowning you in front of everybody. Because it's she will sit back and she will not take charge of the situation. She'll sit there quiet as a darn church mouse. And I'm like, Lady, speak up. Speak up. Grow a spine. You are 21. You're grown. And I know that sounds harsh. I know that's going to be sounding harsh to some of y'all. Y'all can't be like Ronald. She's shy. Trust me, I understand. But it's Lady, at some point you got to take charge. You can't let other people run your life for you. If you think I'm going to sit here and let somebody run my life and embarrass me in front of all these people and have me sitting up here uncomfortable in my own house and I'm supposed to be the head of the household, I think not. This is what frustrates me because I feel the plot is just now starting, but we're on chapter 18 of 27. And so I'm really hoping this ending does not flop. The reason I'm saying she needs to grow a spine is because it's she finally seems to start taking charge. She finally seems to start becoming comfortable, coming into her stuff. And it's every time she does, she falls flat on her face and she goes back into herself. She retreats back into herself. And all of a sudden she want to be shy and demure again and childish. And I'm grow a spine. You dislike that Max will not treat you like a woman. You say he treating you like a child and you don't like it, but he treating you like a child because you acting like a child. Stop acting like a child. Act like you grown. I'm sick of it. We on chapter 18 and 27. You still acting like you don't know what's going on. You been at Manderley for about 3-4 months now. You should have caught on by now how this household runs, and you should be able to figure something out. Like I said, I feel the plot is finally starting to pick up. It's why is it picking up so late in the book? That's why I'm I hope this plot does not flop, because I've been reading this book for 3 months now. And if I spend 3 months reading this book for it to be a flop, I'm gonna be mad. I'm gonna be mad. Lady need to figure her life out. She need to figure her life out and stop letting Miss Danvers embarrass her in front of everybody. It's April 29th. It's about 1:30 in the morning. And I needed to talk about what I just read. Lady is finally getting a backbone. I'm very happy with this. My theory on Mrs. Danvers being Rebecca's mom was wrong. She wasn't her mom. And we finally find out the truth about what happened to Rebecca. And we start getting the picture of who Rebecca really was and just how off base Lady was on Rebecca's personality. And so we're finally getting the truth about what happened to Rebecca. And I'm Daphne du Maurier is really fighting hard to get this 4 out of me. Because right now she's looking at a good 3 out of me. Because the plot has been really slow leading up to this point. And so I'm if this is a slow burn, then it's a very successful slow burn and she'll get this 4. But if this falls flat, like it did a few chapters ago, she's getting a 3. I've got 8 chapters left, so hopefully she don't mess it up. Today is April 29th. I finished reading Rebecca. And yeah, this book was definitely a slow burn. The ending was, I don't even know how to describe that ending. It wasn't bad, but I don't like where it ended. I wish we had got one more chapter. It's an okay enough ending. You can piece together how we got to the beginning from the end, but I feel we should got one more chapter to actually explain how we got to where we were at the beginning of the book. Overall, the book was not bad. It was definitely a slow burn. And another thing, I don't know why people be trying to describe this book as a romance, because it definitely was not a romance. Like, the romance was barely there. I finished Rebecca last night, so let's talk about the rest of this book. So where we left off was Lady was at the ball. She went out there dressed up as Carolyn de Winter, and everybody was like, what in the world is going on? And Max told her to go change. So where we pick up is chapter 18. Lady goes back to her room and Clarice helps her get undressed, and Clarice is sobbing. And Lady tells her to cheer up and get herself together. And so Beatrice comes in. She lets Lady know that, oh, everybody was just so shocked because Rebecca wore that same costume last year. And Lady's like, I should have been more knowledgeable about this. And Beatrice is trying to tell her it's not her fault, but Lady's not trying to hear it. And so Beatrice tries to cheer her up and encourage her to come back downstairs because the party hasn't begun yet. It was just the early guests who came for dinner. Beatrice is like, we'll spin up a story that, oh, your dress didn't fit, that's why you're dressed normally. And Lady, she's like in her feelings. She don't want to come downstairs. Giles comes upstairs to see what's going on because everybody's trying to figure out, okay, where's Lady? Is she going to come back? And so Beatrice tells Giles to basically make something up to explain why she hasn't come back downstairs yet. And Lady tells Beatrice she's not going back downstairs. So Beatrice goes and leaves. And so Lady, of course, she starts feeling out of place again because she feels like she's very unlike Rebecca. She's not knowledgeable of like the customs and stuff. She has such an upper class upbringing and I'm nothing like her, and everybody's laughing at me for not being like her. And so she starts to imagine everybody gossiping about her and Max's marriage and how the marriage isn't happy. She decides to get herself dressed and go downstairs. And as she's going downstairs, it's quiet because everybody is eating. So she's walking towards the stairs and she feels this wind blowing on her, and it's coming from the west wing. So she goes to investigate and she notices that a window has been left open in the west wing, but she doesn't close it. She just goes back to the party. And so Lady says this was her last party at Manderley. She goes do her job as hostess, but Max will not talk to her for the whole night. She and Max are like pretending to be happy, but they're both miserable. And so Lady, of course, she's wishing that the party would end, and she's pretending to be happy, but she's not. So Giles takes her to go watch the fireworks, and then after they end, the party slowly starts to die down. Lady goes back inside and she gets like drawn into like this happy dance and singing, and of course she's like happy for a few seconds, but after it's over, the mood kind of just like dies down and everybody starts leaving, and they all like congratulate Lady on a successful party. And so everybody clears out by about 6 in the morning. So Lady takes herself off to bed and Max does not come to bed. So in the next chapter, Lady wakes up and she realizes that Max never came to bed. She worries that the servants will gossip about them not being happy, and it was because of people gossiping that she went downstairs to the party, because she didn't want people gossiping about her and Max being unhappy. And so Lady, she feels foolish for marrying Max because she feels like she was foolish for believing that Max ever loved her when it's very clear that he's still in love with Rebecca. She can still feel Rebecca's presence everywhere, and she resents Rebecca's presence in her memory in the house because it's like it won't go away. I wrote in my notes, page 233, rant. So I'm like, what are we finna rant about? Get prepared for a rant. I'm going to read it to y'all so y'all can understand what I'm ranting about. She's talking about Mrs. Van Hopper telling her that she won't be happy at Manderley and that she will not fit in at Manderley. I would not listen to her. I thought her hard and cruel. But she was right. She was right in everything. That last mean thrust thrown at me before she said goodbye. You don't flatter yourself he's in love with you, do you? He's lonely. He can't bear that great empty house, was the sanest, most truthful statement she had ever made in her life. Maxim was not in love with me. He had never loved me. Our honeymoon in Italy had meant nothing to him at all, nor our living here together. What I had thought was love for me, for myself as a person, was not love. It was just that he was a man and I was his wife, and was young and he was lonely. He did not belong to me at all. He belonged to Rebecca. He still thought about Rebecca. He would never love me because of Rebecca. She was in the house still, as Mrs. Danvers had said. She was in that room in the west wing. She was in the library, in the morning room, in the gallery above the hall, even in the little flower room where her mackintosh still hung, and in the garden, and in the woods, and down in the stone cottage on the beach. Her footsteps sounded in the corridors. Her scent lingered on the stairs. The servants obeyed her orders still. The food we ate was the food she liked. Her favorite flowers filled the room. Her clothes were in the wardrobes in her room. Her brushes were on the table. Her shoes beneath the chair. Her nightdress on her bed. Rebecca was still mistress of Manderley. Rebecca was still Mrs. De Winter. I had no business here at all. I had come blundering like a poor fool on ground that was preserved. Where is Rebecca? Maxim's grandmother had cried. I want Rebecca. What have you done with Rebecca? She did not know me. She did not care about me. Why should she? I was a stranger to her. I did not belong to Maxim or to Manderley. And Beatrice, at our first meeting, looked me up and down, frank, direct. You're so very different from Rebecca. Frank, reserved, embarrassed when I spoke of her, hating those questions I had poured upon him, even as I had hated them myself, and then answering that final one as we came towards the house. His voice grave and quiet. Yes, she was the most beautiful creature I have ever seen. Rebecca, always Rebecca. Whenever I walked in Manderley, wherever I sat, even in my thoughts and in my dreams, I met Rebecca. I knew her figure now, the long slim legs, the small and narrow feet, her shoulders broader than mine, the capable clever hands, hands that could steer a boat, could hold a horse, hands that arranged flowers, made the models of ships, and wrote Max from Rebecca on the flyleaf of a book. I knew her face too, small and oval, the clear white skin, the cloud of dark hair. I knew the scent she wore. I could guess her laughter and her smile. If I heard it, even among 1,000 others, I should recognize her voice. Rebecca, always Rebecca. I should never be rid of Rebecca. Lady, you know why you can't never be rid of Rebecca? Because you won't take control of Manderley. Stop being shy and take control of this house. You are Mrs. De Winter now. You are the mistress of Manderley. Please behave like it. You ranting and complaining because the house still runs on the schedule of when Rebecca was there, but it's like you told them, don't change anything. Leave everything exactly as it was. Stand up for yourself. Take control of the situation. Become mistress of Manderley. Stop complaining that Rebecca's memory is all over this house when you won't do anything to assert your dominance in the house. At some point, you got to stand up and take control of the situation. You can't be, oh, don't change nothing. Oh, I don't want to step on any toes, and then be complaining because everything still runs how it was running when Rebecca was there. Of course it's going to remind you of Rebecca because it's still running on the schedule as if she was there. You refuse to stand up and establish yourself in this house. And so then she notices that Beatrice left her a note and slid it under the door. So she reads it. Beatrice is telling her, oh, hey girl, we going back home. Don't worry about the dress. I'm sure it'll all blow over really soon. And we haven't seen Max. He was gone before we left. So lady, she wanders around the house and she calls Frank and she expresses to Frank her feelings. And she breaks down and starts crying and she tells Frank it's okay if Max doesn't love her, but she just wants to explain the dress situation to him because she doesn't want him thinking that she did it on purpose. And Frank is like trying to tell her, no, it's not what you think, it's not what you think. He's telling her, I just need to see you in person so I can explain this. And lady's like, she don't want to hear it, so she hangs up the phone and she's just not in a good mood. So it's foggy outside, and so lady, she goes outside for a walk, and as she's walking, she notices that Danvers is once again watching her from the same room that she was watching her from last time. Lady finally decides to do something. She gets pissed off because she's like, this lady set me up. So she marches her tail right back in that house and she goes up to that room to confront Mrs. Danvers. And so when she gets up there, she's like, Mrs. Danvers, and Mrs. Danvers up there crying. And so lady, she's thrown off by this. She didn't expect Mrs. Danvers to be crying. And Danvers is like, why did you ever come here? Why did you have to come to Manderley? We were so happy without you here. Everything was going so well until you showed up. And lady's like, what are you talking about? And Danvers basically goes off. She says she's tired of lady trying to take Rebecca's place. And lady's like, I'm not trying to take Rebecca's place, but you have to understand, I'm the mistress of this house now. And she's like, I know you set me up to wear that dress. Why would you do that? And Danvers starts going on this tangent about how she basically raised Rebecca. She's not Rebecca's mom, so my theory was wrong. But she goes on this tangent about how she raised Rebecca. Rebecca told her everything and how she's known Rebecca since she was a child. And Rebecca's always been headstrong. She always got her way, and she always took life by the reins and basically made it bend to her will. And she admired this about her. And she says that lady makes Max unhappy. When Rebecca was alive, Max was happy, and lady makes him unhappy. He's been unhappy ever since she got there. And she tells lady that you don't belong here, and lady's like, I'm not going nowhere. And she, in her mind, is like, I'm not scared of Mrs. Danvers no more. She ain't nothing to be afraid of. And so then Danvers, realizing that lady's not scared of her no more, she starts like talking about how nobody at Manderley likes her. Everybody's laughing at her behind her back. You know, basically starts playing on lady's insecurities. And she's like, why don't you leave? Why don't you leave? Why don't you just leave and everything go back to the way it was? Like, just jump out the window. I'm not gonna push you out the window. Just jump out the window. Just jump out and break your neck. It'll be swift. It'll be clean. You won't feel no pain. Just go ahead and do it. And so lady, she's standing by the window. Of course, Danvers getting in her mind, so she's like, maybe I should jump out the window because Nobody here seems to like me. There's evidence of that. And so as she's considering jumping out the window, she hears an explosion. And she's like, what is that? And Danvers is like, it must be some rockets from a ship. There must be a ship in the bay. So the next chapter, Max has come running to Manderley. He tells Frith that there is a ship that has come ashore in the bay by accident and it's stuck, and that he needs to get Manderley prepared to like host the sailors and stuff on the ship. And so Danvers and Lady, they decide to table their argument to like get to work. And so Lady goes downstairs and Frith tells her what has happened. And so she walks outside and she looks up at the window she was just standing by, and she feels sick because she realizes that she came so close to jumping out that window, and she starts feeling faint. And so she goes back inside and she asks Frith for some brandy to like get herself back together. And so the fog lifts and Lady realizes that Max has been down at the cove all this time because of the ship. He did not leave and abandon her like she initially thought. And so she starts feeling stupid. She goes down onto the cliffs and she sees the ship. It's stranded. It's a bunch of people that have come from Carith to like observe. She asks like one of the Coast Guard people what's going on. He tells her that they're going to send a diver down to assess the situation. Max took one of the sailors to Carith to be treated for wounds because the sailor lost his head and jumped off the ship and injured himself. And so Frank is also down there at the cliffs, and he talks about how generous Max is, and Lady just is avoiding talking to Frank because she doesn't want to talk about what they just talked about on the phone. And so the excitement dies down and Frank is like, I'm gonna like go home. Do you want me to take you home, Lady? And Lady tells him no because she wants to avoid talking to Frank. And so she talks with some of the people who were down there, and she wishes she could be like them because they're like so carefree and they don't have any worries seemingly. And she's like, but I gotta go back to Manderley and be all alone. I wish I could be like them. And so Lady stays up there till about 3 o'clock, and then she goes down to the beach and she finds Ben. And of course Ben is talking about what he always talks about. And then he mentions something about fish eating her down there, and Lady's like assuming he means like the ship, like the fish eating away at the ship, but she like, that doesn't make sense, so she leaves. And so she gets back home and Frith tells her that Max came looking for her, but Lady was not home. So she goes into the library to have tea, and she just has this unsettling feeling. She feels like something is about to go down, and she also feels different from how she was the night before. And so the ship captain comes to Manderley to see Max, but Max isn't there, so he asks to see Lady. Lady of course is like, okay, I'll see him, and she talks to him, and the ship captain tells her the ship is like ruined, like it's not gonna be able to sail no more, but the reason I'm here is because we found another boat, and in the boat was a body. And so Lady's like, what do you mean there was a body in a boat? And basically it was Rebecca's boat, and there was a body in the boat, and Lady's like, we didn't think there was a second person on board. And so the captain's like, I wanted to tell y'all because we have to report this to the authorities, but we want to make sure y'all are aware of the situation first because there's going to be publicity from this. And so Lady's like, okay, thank you for telling me. And then right at that minute, Max comes home, and so Lady goes outside to sit on the terrace while the captain explains to Max what's going on. And so after the captain leaves, Lady goes back inside to talk to Max. He won't look at her, and so she basically starts apologizing to him. She's like, I'm sorry about last night. And Max is like, what are you talking about? And she's like, I'm sorry about the dress, and aren't you upset with me about the dress? And Max like, oh yeah, I am supposed to be upset with you about that, aren't I? And so Lady realizes that Max not even upset about the dress, and he starts talking about how Rebecca has won because she has overshadowed their happiness. And Lady's like, what are you talking about, Max? And Max is like, the person in the boat is Rebecca. And Lady's like, what do you mean? I thought you identified Rebecca when she washed up 40 miles down the road. And Max is like, no, that's just some random person that I identified as Rebecca to hide what I did. I shot and killed Rebecca, and I put her in the boat, and I sunk the boat, and now it's been discovered. And so he's like, Lady, do you still love me?
I didn't know Ratchet was a language. This is in Ratchet.
Lady is like, she's in shock. She's like, what? What do you mean you shot and killed Rebecca and sunk her boat and identified another body to cover it up? Max, he's proclaiming his love to her. He kisses her, but Lady, she's in shock, so she's not really responding. So he's like, see, I knew it. You don't love me anymore because of what I've confessed. And Lady's like, no, that's not true. I'm just shocked. But Max doesn't believe her. He's like, no, you don't love me anymore. I guess it's too late for you to love me, and everybody will find out what's happened. And so Lady, she starts piecing together everything. Max starts breaking down about how hard it was for him to uphold the lie of how he was the loving husband of Rebecca when he really hated her. And he didn't tell Lady about this because she seemed unhappy at Manderley. And Lady's like, had you told me sooner, I wouldn't have been going through what I was going through, because this whole time I've been believing that you've been in love with Rebecca and that you didn't want any of her memory coming up because you were so in love with her and grieving her. And Max is like, I hated that girl. I hated her from the moment I married her because she was harsh and she was mean and she was fake. She would find out something about you that she liked and she would turn herself into that person so that you would like her and adore her. But that's not the real her. The cliff in Monte Carlo that he took Lady to, he also took Rebecca there like he told her before. But when he took her up there, he was considering killing her because he hated her, because that's when he found out about the real her. That was like 5 days after they were married. That's when he found out about the real her, so he considered killing her there. But Rebecca made him a deal. She's like, I'll run Manderley, I'll make it famous, I'll make it known, and all you have to do is pretend to love me and stay out my business. And so Max, he agreed to it because he wanted Manderley to be well taken care of and wanted it to be famous. And he didn't want a failed marriage and a bad reputation, because Rebecca, she was doing some shady stuff and he didn't want that affecting his reputation, and he didn't want that affecting Manderley's reputation. So he agreed to let her run the house in exchange for not revealing who she truly was and basically upholding the lie that they have a happy marriage. Rebecca hated everybody, and she had this flat in London that she would go to like entertain her lovers, but she hated all her lovers. She hated everybody. She didn't like anybody except Mrs. Danvers. Rebecca, she started getting careless and she started flirting with Frank. She flirted with Giles, and Beatrice suspected that Rebecca was flirting with Giles, and so that's why she and him had never been back to Manderley until Max married Lady. And that's also why she said that Lady was so different from Rebecca, because Lady was nice and sweet while Rebecca was mean and horrible. And so Lady starts to realize that she's misunderstood the whole situation, and what she thought was everybody loving Rebecca was really like everybody hating Rebecca. And that's why everybody said, you're so much different from her. Then she realizes that had she not been so shy and had she just asked questions, she would have realized everybody really liked her. Max reveals that it was Frank who told him about Jack's visit because Frank saw Jack's car. And so he knew that Max did not like Jack, so he told about the visit. He told Rebecca, if I ever see Jack around here, I'm killing him on sight. Rebecca, she started to kind of like come unraveled, and she started looking very sick. And so the night that she returned from London, she would take Jack down to her cottage. And so the night that she returned from London, Max came back and he realized that Rebecca was down at the cottage. And so he took his gun and he was going to go down there to frighten Rebecca and Jack. He didn't have no plans of like killing them. He was just going to frighten them to kind of like uphold his threat, because he told Rebecca, if you don't shape up, I'm going to kill Jack. He goes down there to frighten her, but Rebecca is down there alone. And so he tells her again, Rebecca, if you don't get your life together, I'm going to kill Jack, because I'm not dealing with this. You're not going to ruin Manderley's reputation with your foolishness. And Rebecca, she's like, child, I ain't worried about you, because even if you expose me, nobody's gonna believe it, because we've played the role of the happy couple so well that everybody believes that we are this happy, loving couple. You have no proof to prove that we were unhappy, and you have no proof to prove that I have been unfaithful, and that you have enough reasonable proof to divorce me, because we've played this role so well. And also, I mean, think about it, Max. Isn't a son what you've always wanted? Isn't an heir what you've always wanted? Just imagine my child running around Manderley and everything will be left to him. Nobody will believe you when he said that the child's not yours. He flies into a fit of rage and he shoots Rebecca in the heart, and she's laughing when she dies. And so Max, he's freaking out because it's a lot of blood. So he basically wipes up all the blood with water from the cove. Then he takes Rebecca out to the ship. He locks her in the cabin of the ship and he sinks the boat. But he has such a hard time getting the boat out onto the bay that he sinks it in a place that's really close to the shore, but it's deep enough to hide the ship. And nobody would have known about this except that the ship that's run ashore has discovered the ship. And so now he's like, it's all over. Everybody's gonna know what I did. And so Lady's she started planning. She no, we gonna figure out a way to get you out of this, because nothing's gonna separate us.
I didn't know ratchet was a language. This is in ratchet.
They're going to attempt to raise Rebecca's boat out of the water at 5:30 in the morning so that they can investigate it and figure out who the body is that's in there. And so Lady tells Max, okay, at the inquest, just say that you identified the other body by mistake because you were sick with grief. And she tells him to say that because nobody can prove otherwise. Max gets a phone call and he goes to take it, and Lady is glad that her impressions about Rebecca were wrong, and that she's glad that Rebecca was a terrible person, because now she can stop feeling bad about all the reminders of her around there, and she can no longer feel overshadowed, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to protect Max. The Colonel is the one who calls Max to let Max know about what's going on, and he wants to question Max on whether he mistakenly identified the body as Rebecca when it wasn't her. And he tells him that him and the inspector are going to be at the recovery tomorrow because it's standard that they be there. And so Max and Lady, after this phone call, they go on about business as usual. Lady is happy that she can finally be happy with Max without regret. And so things at Manderley are starting to get sloppy. The staff is getting sloppy. They not doing their jobs properly. And Lady's like, oh, absolutely not. Y'all are going to do this correct. And so she finally starts taking control of Manderley because she like, things right here going to change. Y'all going to do y'all jobs properly. And so she makes some changes to the menu. They were serving leftovers from the fancy dress ball. And so Lady's like, we not having leftovers. We gonna eat something fresh and hot. And so Mrs. Danvers comes to confront her about it because she's like, oh, if you wanted to change the menu, you could have told me directly. You didn't have to go through Robert. Rebecca would tell me directly what she wanted changed. And Lady's like, well, I'm not Rebecca. If I choose to tell you the changes of the menu through Robert, that's what I'm gonna do. And she's like, Rebecca is dead. I am Mrs. De Winter now. We are going to start doing things my way.
A bit of spirit after all.
And Mrs. Danvers is like, she's shocked. She is shocked. Mrs. Danvers, she starts questioning Lady about the boat, and Lady, of course, is denying everything. Mrs. Danvers is like, oh, the staff, they pretty much know about it, so, like, what's going on? And Lady is denying everything. She's like, I don't know nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. And so the boat is successfully raised out of the water and is taken to care of to be inspected. Max has Frank and the Colonel to lunch. They avoid talking about it because Frith is in the room and they don't want nobody outside of the situation knowing what's going on. And so eventually Frith leaves, and so they start talking about it. And the Colonel advises Max to just say that he mistakenly identified the body because that's what they believe has happened. And he regrets that it will like bring a lot of publicity to the De Winters and to Max. And so during this conversation, Lady realizes that Frank knows the truth about what happened, but Max does not know that Frank knows. And the Colonel thinks it's extraordinary how Rebecca died because Rebecca was known to be an avid sailor and she wouldn't make such an elementary mistake such as leaving her ship unattended for it to capsize. And so the Colonel and Frank leave, and Max and Lady, they talk about the situation, and Max tells Lady that he's glad that he told her, but he also regrets it because now Lady has lost like her youthful look. She looks more womanly now. And so of course Lady is, in the next chapter, she's still denying any knowledge of anything outside of what's already been reported. And so Frith brings her the paper and Lady says it's dreadful. And Frith echoes what the Colonel says. He wonders how Rebecca made such an elementary mistake because she was an avid sailor. He can't imagine her making such a mistake like that. And of course, since the news has now come out, Mrs. Danvers is in shock. She basically goes into recluse in the house, and she's just basically running the house remotely from her room. And so the news has sensationalized the story. They have played up the fact that it's ironic that Rebecca's body was discovered the day after the fancy dress ball. Max is upset about the publicity, and Frank is doing his best to manage the situation. Beatrice, she wants to come to the house to like find out what's going on, but she can't because her son is sick. And Frank tells Max to just focus on what he's going to say at the inquest. And so the inquest happens. Lady goes up there, but she chooses not to go in the building because she doesn't want to hear Max testify. So she decides to like walk around town a little bit, and this policeman spots her, and so she walks back to the building where the inquest is happening, and the policeman is like, oh, you can't come in here, you can't wait in here. But then he looks at her, he's like, oh wait, you're Mrs. De Winter, yes, you can come in here. And so Lady's like, I just need somewhere to rest real quick, and he's like, come with me, I'll take you to like this room. So he takes her to this room, and she rests in there, and she asks, oh, how long is the inquest going to be? And so he goes and finds out, and he's like, not very long now. The last person is up there testifying. And Lady's like, oh, okay, can I go in there and listen? And the policeman is like, of course. So he takes her in there. And so when she gets in there, she notices that Mrs. Danvers and Jack are at the inquest. And she's like, what are they doing here? And the person up on the stand is boat builder who built Rebecca's boat. He testifies that Rebecca was very particular about her boat, and he built it very sturdy to the point that there is no way it could capsize. He basically reveals in his investigation that there were holes made in the ground, and that like these valves that are supposed to remain closed to keep water from rushing in and sinking the boat. He says that those valves were open and that there were holes in the boat, and that they were not holes caused from hitting rocks. They were holes that were man-made. And so everybody is shocked by this. They start asking Max questions. Lady, she starts feeling faint, and so Max is like, somebody get my wife, she about to faint. And so she faints. And so Lady wakes up back in the waiting room. Frank and the policeman have taken her out of the room, and so Frank has been ordered by Max to take Lady home, and he tells her that it might be a while before Max gets home, and Lady, she starts worrying. She's worried that Max is going to be caught. She's worried that it's the end for them. She just lies down to distract herself, and Jasper comes to lay with her, and she's glad that Jasper comes to lay with her because he's such a comfort to her. Max returns, and he tells her that it was ruled as Rebecca killing herself, and the only reason he was able to stay strong with his story was because Lady fainted, and seeing her realized that he needs to stay strong for Lady. And Frank went to see the vicar so they can get Rebecca buried, and the burial will take place the next day. And Max tells Lady that he doesn't want her at the burial. And so it starts raining, and Jack comes to see Lady. He's like, I've come to talk to Max. He starts beating around the bush, and Lady's like, if you're not gonna tell me why you're here, then you need to go. And so Jack is like, I know Rebecca did not kill herself, and I'm gonna get justice for her. And so Max comes home. He's like, what are you doing in my house? And Jack is like, I know what you did, Max, and I'm gonna prove it. Max is like, you need to get on somewhere. And Jack's like, I'm not going nowhere. Me and Rebecca were lovers. They were first cousins, and they were lovers.
I didn't know Ratchet was a language. This is in Ratchet.
And he wants the truth about what's going on. So he tells Max about the note, and he basically tells Max, either you give me some money to stay quiet, or I'm gonna go to the police. And so Max is like, call him. Jack thinks he's bluffing, so Max goes and calls the Colonel. He's like, Colonel, I need you to come out here. We got a situation. And so the Colonel comes out there, and Jack basically tells the Colonel, I believe Max murdered Rebecca, and I have this note as proof that Rebecca was not intending to kill herself. And so because of the way Jack presents it, the Colonel like, you are drunk. And so Jack's like, I'm not drunk. I know what I'm talking about. And so the Colonel's like, do you have any proof? And Jack's like, I have this note. And the Colonel like, that's not proof. I need some irrefutable proof. And so Jack is like, well, what if I tell you I got a witness who saw the whole thing? Frank and Lady, they start getting all nervous, but Max is like, he just stoic. Jack tells the Colonel about Ben. He says Ben is always down at the beach. Ben probably witnessed it. And so Lady finally starts putting together the whole time in this whole book, Ben has been talking about Rebecca and about how she was at the bottom of the bay, and she realizes that Ben saw the whole thing. And so she starts worrying because she's like, oh my gosh, Ben is gonna give us up. He's gonna reveal everything. So they go and fetch Ben. He's very scared to talk, scared that they're gonna put him in the asylum. Max is like, nobody's gonna put you in the asylum. Jack is like, do you recognize me? Ben is like, no. Jack starts going off. He's like, you recognize me. You saw me with Rebecca all the time. But Ben is like, I don't recognize you. So the Colonel starts asking him questions related to the incident. Ben is like, I don't know nothing. Can I leave? And Max is like, yes, get him some food and then take him back home. And so Jack is like, oh, y'all paid him off. That's why he won't speak. He knows me. He knows what he saw. The Colonel is like, your witness was no help. And so Jack is like, well, I got another witness who can attest to the fact, and she'll be more helpful. And so then he goes and gets Mrs. Danvers. And the Colonel, while they're getting Mrs. Danvers, he says that Ben seemed scared, and he's skeptical about why Ben seemed scared. And Max is like, I don't know why. But Lady knows why. It's because Rebecca kept threatening him. Mrs. Danvers comes. They ask her some questions. She's like, I know that went to get her hair done at noon, and then she always had lunch about 1:30. Jack is like, what does this have to do with anything? Mrs. Danvers, she's like, well, Rebecca kept this diary of what she would do throughout the day, and I have it. So she goes and gets it, and she shows it to him, and they come across this name named Baker at about 2 o'clock that she met with, and they're like, who is Baker? And so they find his number, and they call around to find him. Baker was a doctor, and he quit practicing medicine about 6 months ago. And so Lady is nervous because she's like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the end. And so Mrs. Danvers, she's wondering why Rebecca would keep Baker a secret from her, because Rebecca told her about everything. And so Lady's like, they have all the pieces, but they can't put it together. And so Max, of course, he gives her this look like this is the end. And Jack is like, what does any of this have to do with anything? What does this have to do with what Max did to her? And so Mrs. Danvers starts putting together what Jack is talking about, and she gets this vengeful look in her eyes towards Max. And everybody in the room starts kind of putting together what Jack is getting at. And so they plan to go see the doctor the next day. Max and Lady, they spend their night together. They kind of treat it like it's their last night of freedom. Beatrice calls because she's floored about the ruling of the verdict. She's like, y'all need to get that verdict changed, because there's no way Rebecca would kill herself. She was not the type of person. Y'all need to see if y'all can get that verdict changed, because that's going to affect the reputation of the family and of Manderley. Lady, she encourages Beatrice not to do anything, not to talk to nobody, not to try to get anybody to change the verdict. And so then she and Max spend the night together. And so Lady, she packs to leave for London, and she's like, she feels uneasy leaving because she feels like something is going to happen, and she feels very sad about leaving Manderley for some reason. And so she's like looking around at everything, trying to take everything in one last time. And so they go to see Baker at 9 in the morning. They drive up to London. It's a very long drive. It's a very irritable drive. They get there about 3 o'clock. They start talking to Baker about what happened. Dr. Baker is like, I don't remember seeing nobody by the name of Mrs. De Winter. And so they're like, it's possible she gave a fake name. And so he goes and gets his appointment book, and he's like, oh yes, I saw somebody by the name of Mrs. Danvers.
I'm really not surprised.
And so everybody is shocked because why would she give the name of Mrs. Danvers? And so Baker reveals that she had cancer and there was no possible way that she would ever have kids. They thank him and then they leave. And so Jack is like, oh my gosh, she had cancer. Is cancer contagious? And everybody just tells him to go on about his business. They tired of him. And the colonel tells him, if you ever come back to our district, I will have you arrested for blackmail and for manslaughter. The colonel asks them to drop him off at his sister's house. So they drop him off and they go to have dinner at this restaurant. And so while they're there, Max realizes that Rebecca basically tricked him into killing her so that she could go out on her own terms. And Lady suspects that the colonel knows the truth about what happened. And Max is like, he suspects that he knows too, but he thinks that the colonel won't give them up because it's just, it'd be too messy. Max, he goes to make a call to Frank to tell them what happened, and Frank tells him that Mrs. Danvers has left Manderley. She just cleared out, didn't tell nobody that she was leaving, packed up all her stuff and left, and that was it. She got a phone call and then she was gone. Max doesn't like it. He thinks something is wrong, so he tells Lady, we need to get going back to Manderley. We're gonna drive through the night. So they drive it down there. Lady keeps having these strange dreams. And so she wakes up, she tells Max that she's thirsty, so they stop and they get something to drink, and then they keep going. Lady has more strange dreams. They get down there to Manderley, and Lady's like, oh, the sun is coming out really early. And Max is like, that's not the sun, that's Manderley. And Lady's like, what are you talking about? So they pull up, and Manderley is on fire. And that is how the book ends. So my final thoughts on Rebecca the book are, I gave it a 3.5 out of 5. It's a slow burn, and by slow burn, I do mean slow burn. Picked up at the end. I call her Lady, but her name is Mrs. De Winter. Lady was getting on my nerves the whole book. It's like she was shy and she wouldn't stand up for herself. And I'm like, okay, Lady, at some point you need to take control of the situation. But it's like every opportunity that would come for her to take control of the situation, she would not do it. And then by the time she finally decides to take control of the situation, it's too late. The twist with Rebecca, that was well done. It was little inklings and little clues leading up to the twist that, like, if you like were really like paying attention, you probably caught on to what was going on. But the twist of Max killing Rebecca, I was like, oh wow. Okay, oh wow. And then even then, it's like the twist is not even that Max killed her, but the twist is that Rebecca talked him into killing her. Rebecca still got her way. She still won even in the end. It just took a really long time to read, and it was an okay book. It was definitely a slow burn thriller. It definitely succeeded in that aspect. I'm back because I have some more thoughts on Rebecca. So after reading the book, I went and read some other reviews to see what other people thought of it. And this one review described Lady as being a pick-me, and I have to agree. She was a pick-me. Everything she did was so that Max would love her, so Max would be angry with her. It was all for Max's attention. We don't really know anything about her other than the fact that both her parents are dead. She has the same name as her dad, and she likes to sketch. And even her liking to sketch is not really brought up again after she moves to Manderley until the ball, because she wants to surprise Max, because he keeps teasing her about what she's going to go as. Once she got to Manderley, she had no more interest. She didn't have no interest outside of Max. She didn't have no life outside of Max. All her thoughts were about Max. Everything was Max, Max, Max. Your husband just confessed to you he killed his first wife. And your whole thought process is, oh, at least he didn't love her. He loves me. Hello, ma'am. This man just told you he killed his first wife because he hated her. You said yourself that he likes you in the way that he likes Jasper the dog. So what happens when he gets tired of you, lady? Put the pieces together. He probably gonna kill you too. Her whole life revolves around Max. And if Max is not happy with her, it upsets her. If Max is not happy, period, it upsets her. She had no interest outside of Max once she hit Manderley. She had no life outside of Max once she hit Manderley. She had no friends outside of Max once she hit Manderley. She had no friends before that, but come on now. A whole pick me for Max, the murderer. Even the little interest that we did know about her having, like for example, sketching, she doesn't sketch anymore once she hits Manderley. Beatrice bought her all them art books. Not once did she use them in the book because she was so worried about Max and what he thought. And you know, I even saw a tweet today that said it was a man explaining that pick-me's are just women with common sense who are telling other women without common sense what to do to get a man. And I'm like, it's a very bad and wrong explanation, but it's the perfect way to explain Lady. Lady had no common sense, which is crazy because at the beginning of the book, she very clearly has common sense compared to Mrs. Van Hopper. But then as soon as she hit Manderley, no common sense. Whole identity just gone. What little identity she had is gone. It's brilliant. Lady's shyness and her lack of identity is what makes Rebecca work. It's what makes Manderley work. I say all that to say Lady was a pick-me. It was annoying, but it works for the story because her being a pick-me, she don't have no identity. And that works because the whole point of the story is that she does not have an identity. Her identity is overshadowed by Rebecca, number one. But also number two, she is primarily seen as a replacement for Rebecca as Max's wife. So everything she's doing, everything she does is for Max's attention, Max's approval. She wanted to be chose so badly, and she was chose by Max. So I'm going to get into watching these adaptations. So let's talk my preconceived notions on these movies. Like I said, the reason I know about Rebecca is because of the 1940 version, because that's one of my mom's favorite movies. And of course, I know about the 2020 version. I've heard that version is not that good. There's actually a lot more adaptations of Rebecca than just those two. As far as like the adaptations aside from those two, I don't really have no preconceived notions of them because I just found out about them. So I'm just hoping those are good. I don't remember very much from the 1940 version. I get the feeling though it's probably going to be my favorite version because it's like the most beloved version of Rebecca. And so because of that, I am setting it at a disadvantage. It is going to be the last version that I watch. Usually I like to watch adaptations, especially when something has multiple adaptations. I like to watch them in order that they came out. But with this one, because I get the feeling that I'm really going to love it, and because I want to give all the other versions a fair chance to stack up against it, I'm going to watch it last. And I'm going to watch the 2020 version first because a lot of people don't like that version, but I'm wondering if they don't like it because they would compare it to the 1940 version because they consider it to be a remake of that movie. And I'm like, is it a remake of that movie or is it a new adaptation of the book, but y'all just assume that it's a remake of that movie? So those are my preconceived notions. Let's watch these adaptations. So now I'm going to get into the adaptations of Rebecca that I watched. Instead of discussing all of the differences between the book and its adaptations, I will be ranking these based on my enjoyment of them. They will still receive ratings on how close to the source material they were, as well as how they do in their own right as standalone works, but their placements in this ranking will be determined by how much I personally enjoyed the adaptation. So before I get into them, I got some interesting facts I would like to share. The first interesting fact is that Daphne du Maurier adapted Rebecca herself for the stage the first time. The next interesting fact is the first radio adaptation was done by Orson Welles following his infamous War of the Worlds radio adaptation, and his radio show features an interview with Daphne du Maurier, and it also features promotion for the then upcoming 1940 film. And my last interesting fact is that Rebecca was adapted into a successful 2006 German musical. Now, there was an attempted Broadway version based on this musical in the late 2000s and early 2010s that infamously failed to hit the stage due to troubled production and corrupt leadership, which resulted in legal battles. I suggest y'all read up on that situation, go watch some videos on it, because that was a very interesting situation. Now, with that being said, let's get into these adaptations of Rebecca. And I just want to say that a benchmark for how well the adaptation was done, how much did Lady get on my nerves? If she got on my nerves a lot, that meant she was close to her book depiction, which meant that it was a good adaptation. If she didn't get on my nerves, that meant the adaptation was a little iffy, because the level of nerve wracking that Lady was determined how well done Manderley was, because Lady being shy and being irritating was heavily tied to how mystifying Manderley is. So the more irritating she is, the more mystifying it is. The less irritating she is, and the less mystifying it was. This ranking is going to be a little weird because y'all gonna see. I just want to say that none of these adaptations are bad. All of the adaptations are well done. And second, which is last, we have a tie. And the tie is between Rebecca 2020, and Rebecca 1979. Rebecca 1979, this 4-episode BBC miniseries was written by Hugh Whitemore and directed by Simon Langton. It starred Joanna David as Mrs. De Winter, Jeremy Brett as Max De Winter, and Anna Massey as Mrs. Danvers. It released on January 11th, 1979 in the United Kingdom and March 11th, 1980 in the United States. It was nominated for a BAFTA for Best Sound Supervisor. I gave this version a 4.5 out of 5 for adaptation and 4 out of 5 as a show. It was well done and stuck very close to the book storyline. The build up to seeing Manderley for the first time was exciting, but Manderley itself seemed sort of plain in this version. It didn't have the mysterious vibe, though it did try to capture it in some parts. They did try to show like some of Lady's insecurities. The vibe is that Manderley is mystifying in the book. A huge reason of that is because Lady is very shy and she's very scared of everything at Manderley, so it seems more mystifying and more scary than it really is. The reason this is in technically last but second enjoyment wise, even though it's probably the most faithful to the story, it was dull. Like, they adapted the story and they did their best, all things considered, because you know, this production was a little low budget. They stuck close to the story. The acting was well done. It was just dull. Look at Lady's face when Max told her that he killed Rebecca. I could not stop laughing at this part. Her face was like, oh my gosh, are you serious? And then she went right back into pick-me mode. Rebecca 2020. This Netflix film was written by Jane Goldman, Joe Shrapnel, and Anna Waterhouse, and was directed by Ben Wheatley. It starred Lily James as Mrs. De Winter, Armie Hammer as Mac De Winter, and Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers, and released on October 16th, 2020 in the United States and October 21st, 2020 in the United Kingdom. It was nominated for a BAFTA for Best Production Design. I gave this version a 3 out of 5 for both adaptation and a 3 out of 5 as a movie. The storyline was relatively close to the book, but the atmosphere was off. Lady took more control and was more outspoken in this version, especially in the finale, but it was at the cost of Manderley losing some of its mysticism, and she never really seemed to be as overshadowed by Rebecca. Movie-wise, a lot of things fell flat narrative-wise, and some of Lady's decisions didn't make sense. For example, her decision to have the ball, because nobody brought it up to her. She just saw an invitation in Rebecca's desk and decided, we gonna have a ball. The finale seemed all over the place, and some character motivations didn't make sense. It was also more structured as a romance, more so than a thriller. They structured the story to focus more on the romance between Lady and Max. And so everything that happens is either something that benefits their romance or is a challenge to their romance. So Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca, they're not as impactful as they should be. Yes, they're antagonists to the romance, but the romance is like more important than the thriller aspect. But some things I did like about this version, I loved the look of it. Like, the visual was very appealing. They definitely deserve that nomination for Best Production Design because the production design was amazing in this movie. I think the look of Manderley in this film was my favorite look of it, but the atmosphere was off because Lady was not as shy as she was supposed to be, and Manderley's mysticism is tied to how shy Lady is. And the other thing I love is that because they focus more on the romance, Mrs. Danvers, she's still Mrs. Danvers, but like how she should be is not as impactful. So one thing I like is that because Lady is more outspoken and less shy in this version, they had to up Mrs. Danvers a little bit. So Mrs. Danvers, her revenge plot with the ball is a lot more interesting because she kind of like works her way into being more of a trusting person to Lady, and we kind of see them getting along. And I like that because it makes the portrayal seem more heartbreaking because it seems like Lady was finally getting on with Mrs. Danvers. They seem like they was finally getting along. Everything was going well, only for this to have all been just one big revenge plot. But I will say this, Lady standing up for herself against Mrs. Danvers was satisfying a little bit, but it's also what made me realize that Lady being shy is what made Manderley work. Coming in first, we have another tie between Rebecca 1940 and Rebecca 1997. Rebecca 1940. This film version, done by Selznick International Pictures, was adapted by Philip McDonald and Michael Hogan, written by Robert E. Sherwood and Joan Harrison, and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It stars Joan Fontaine as Mrs. De Winter, Laurence Olivier as Max De Winter, and Judith Anderson as Mrs. Danvers. I gave this version a 3 out of 5 for adaptation and a 5 out of 5 as a movie. Although the filmmakers tried to remain as close and faithful to the original story as possible, some elements of the story were impacted by the censorship of the Hays Production Code, which dictated what could and could not be in films during the time between 1934 and 1968. Rebecca 1940 was nominated for 10 Oscars and won 2 for Best Picture and Best Cinematography. So going into this version, I really thought that Rebecca 1940 was gonna be my favorite, to the point that I watched all the other versions before it because I just felt like no other version was gonna be able to compete against it. I just knew it was gonna be amazing, and it was amazing. It was a good film, but I'm not gonna lie, I was enjoying it until we hit the twist. Now, I knew that the Hays Production Code was going to impact the narrative of the story because there was no way they were going to show Max killing Rebecca and getting away with it. So I knew they were either going to have Max convicted, because that was a requirement. If a crime was committed, the person had to be punished, or they was going to change it so that Max could still get away with it, but like he not be responsible. And that's what ended up happening. They changed it to where instead of killing her, Max slapped her. She stood there stunned for a few minutes, then collapsed and hit her head on ship tackle and died. And Max, he was nervous he would be convicted because he was in a fit of rage. I didn't like the way they did it because it just seemed so out there, but thinking about it and thinking about how strict the code was, it was the only way that they would be able to do it, because they can't say Rebecca ended her life because depictions of ending your life was also heavily censored, so they couldn't go that route and say that she just did it herself. The way they did it was the only way they could accomplish it, and unfortunately that did impact my enjoyment of the movie a little bit, but Rebecca 1940 is still an amazing movie. I still enjoyed it. And that leads me into the other version, Rebecca 1997. This 2-episode miniseries was a collaboration between Carlton Television, Portman Productions, and WGBH. It was written by Arthur Hopcraft and directed by Jim O'Brien. It starred Amelia Fox as Mrs. De Winter, Charles Dance as Max De Winter, Diana Rigg as Mrs. Danvers, and Lucy Cohu as Rebecca. It released on January 5th, 1997 in the United Kingdom and April 13th, 1997 in the United States. Diana Rigg won an Emmy for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Mrs. Danvers. I gave this version a 3.5 out of 5 for adaptation and a 4.5 out of 5 as a show. I enjoyed everything about it, especially the background music, but they did change some elements of the story for drama. Lady would swing back and forth between being shy and being outspoken, and Manderley fit the vibe of the book very well. Interesting fact, Amelia Fox, who played Mrs. De Winter in this version, is the daughter of Joanna David, who played Mrs. De Winter in the 1979 version. So like I said, I thought Rebecca 1940 was gonna be my favorite, but I was surprised by how much I enjoyed the 1997 version. It was entertaining, it was good, everything was just well done. Rebecca 1940 is perfect for if I want to watch a Hitchcock film, if I want to watch a movie that's really well done, really well acted, and don't care about the story being faithful to the book. Rebecca 1997 is a version I want to watch if I want to watch a version that's really well done, really well acted, and I want to watch a version that's faithful to the book. I enjoyed both of these versions. They both deserve first. Thank you for tuning into this video. If you liked it, give it a like and a comment, and be sure to subscribe to my channel and check out more content on my channel. And I'll see you next time.